started at Easter, we start with the idea that God comes and He makes us forgiven. In fact, if you look at in your bulletin, it's got that contact card. On the back of the contact card, in the notes, there's a little group of phrases that actually has a little fill-in spot on it. And we started out a few weeks ago with this idea that God forgives us. And that He begins by forgiving us for what we've done wrong. And then He takes us and He forgives us, not for no reason, but for a specific reason. That He forgives us in order to send us into battle. In order to send us into war. And that battle is not what we think it is. We think it's a battle against the world out there. We think it's a battle against other cultures or other religions. But what we find is it's a battle inside our heart. A battle against those things of this world that would deceive us and would choke out the work of Christ in our life. And a battle within ourselves against the philosophies that would grab hold of us and suck us in and pull us closer. But the reality is that when you go to battle, you get wounded. That when you go to fight, you get hurt. And in this fight within ourselves, we come to a point where we become injured. And we have to deal with that. As I think about my own life, I think about those ways in which God has shown my weakness. It always seems to center around issues of my pride. Things that I take pride in, taking pride in my education. In fact, this morning, very, very kindly, in the middle of our Sunday school class, I was talking about Laura having her doctorate in teaching. And Sarah looks over and she goes, well, you've got your doctorate too. And I'm like, well, yeah. But that taking pride in that, holding on to that, and using that to think well of myself. Or beginning to, some of you have heard me say before, this is not my first rodeo. Between Campus Crusade for Christ and serving while I was in seminary and being a pastor, I've been in ministry 24 years. And sometimes when I say that this is not my first rodeo, it's a good thing. Because somebody comes to me and they're like, oh my gosh, Pastor, I can't believe this terrible situation happened in my life. This sorrow came in. I had this moral failure. And I can look at them and I go, this is not my first rodeo. You are not the only person this has happened to. It's okay. You're not alone. You're not the only one. This way that you feel you failed God is not permanent, and God's not going to reject you. And I've seen other people come out of it and their lives get better. Or being able to tell people they're not alone in the difficult news that they've received. But sometimes, I have to admit, it's more of, well, this isn't my first rodeo. I know a thing or two about being a pastor, and I know a thing or two about things of God, and you should listen to me pontificate about how smart I am. And it's always when that happens that God seems to have something come along and hit me right about the ankles and knock me flat on my backside. That one of the children will pop up with a question I have no answer for. That I'll come up and do children's sermon and they will manage to gallop off into the sunset without me, desperately trailing and trying to get control back. That somehow in that moment of pride and of thinking too well of myself, that the Lord will hit me with my weakness. And I will realize how much I depend on Him. And I will be reminded anew that when I go into that battle with myself to follow God, that sometimes I lose and sometimes I get hurt. And that weakness is a part of God's plan. That having that displayed in my life is a part of God's plan. And for each one of us, as we walk through life, as we deal with life, we have these places where we take pride. We have these places where we think highly of ourselves. And so often, the best way to look at it or identify it in our life is that we ask the question, what do we not pray about? You see, when we feel overwhelmed and we feel uncertain and we feel afraid, and we're on our knees and we're going, Lord God, please help me with this. I don't know what to do. God, please help me figure out what comes next. God, please show me what to do. But when we think we've got the situation under control, when we think we know what we're doing, when we think we've got it covered, we tend not to pray so intently. We tend not to ask God so much. We tend to think, I've got it handled. And so often that's right where God comes in and knocks us back down and grabs hold of us and gets our mind refocused on Him. In fact, the reality is that God has shown us that our weakness is so often a vehicle of His strength. And this morning, I'm not asking you just to take it from me. Art Revis is going to come up and speak a little bit about how God has used weakness in His own life to show His glory and His strength.
Hello, my name's Art. I haven't always had this nice little handy accessory that I'm carrying around with me. Back in 2009, I was afflicted with a disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And I won this lovely disease out of the 2 in 1 million chance of a side effect you can get from a flu shot. And I became, ding, 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 your lucky winner. So, but back around that time, I was reading the book of Job. And I always thought, how could you have such a relationship with God after something like that? And I was discussing with my wife and everything else. It was around the holidays back in 2009, around Thanksgiving. And I said, I don't know. I don't think I could have that great of a relationship with God after that. And we had discussed, what would you think would be your, Job moment? And my Job moment, always in the back of my mind, was I could never handle being paralyzed. I saw my mother go through it, and I was like, I couldn't do it. I could not be an invalid and have somebody have to take care of me and not being able to move. Well, the main thing of Guillain-Barré syndrome is it eats away at your, instead of creating a thing to fight the flu virus, it instead attacks your nervous system. It eats away all the myelin sheath, the covering of your nerves. And so it just basically says, hey, your nerves don't belong in your body, let's destroy them. And that's what it started to do. And it was the most intense pain I've ever felt in my life. But I became paralyzed. And so me and God had it out. I mean, the quick, typical, why me, and all this, and I was an angry person. You can ask my friends that visited me in the hospital once I was off the life support and out of a coma and everything else. I was angry. The doctors had told my wife, make arrangements. He is not going to survive this because I had ended up with other side effects in the hospital. My lungs had filled up with fluid, and just other things had hit, and they said, do it. We've given him every treatment we can think of to beat this, and there's no way. He's not going to survive. And that's when God said, hey, now's my turn. And He turned it around. All of a sudden, within 48 hours, I had turned the corner, and they were like, wow, this is incredible. It must have been something we done. And my wife was like, no, it's not something you did. So I went through rehab. I was 3.5 months in the hospital, but I found that my relationship with God during that point became stronger. Instead of pushing Him away, I brought Him more into me. Without God, I would not have survived this, without this relationship with Him. And the bond became stronger. You would think it would be the other way around. You think it would be like, I'm going to put you away because of this. And I'm only 90% recovered. I still have side effects of chronic fatigue and PTSD, and also diabetes, and all the nice little wonderful side effects that come along with Guillain-Barré syndrome. But my relationship with God has become so tight and so great. And that's, even with this burden that, that I carry, sometimes I don't see it around as a burden, sometimes I do. But my love of God has become great, and has become greater than anything that I could ever imagine. And I think, God just was like, hey, look, you did survive. I did put you through this, but you survived, and my relationship has come just complete. There's no other way to describe it.
Thank you. God's not surprised by that. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 7. This is what God says. This is what Paul is writing as he talks about his relationship with God. And just to set this up a little bit, one of the things about Paul is Paul had 3 great visions in his life. The 3 great visions, and first of all, the one that we read about where as he was going up to persecute and throw in jail and kill some Christians, that Jesus appeared to him, knocked him off his donkey, and he's laying there on the ground, and Jesus says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And in that day, in that moment, Saul turns around and becomes Paul, and changes from coming after Christianity to going ahead and becoming a Christian. The second vision we know that Paul has is he has this vision that God says he gives him at that time of all he will suffer to bring the message of Christ to the Gentiles. We know this because the man who comes and baptizes Paul, his name is Ananias. And Ananias, when God is saying, "You need to go see Saul," Ananias is going, "Have you read the papers? Do you know who this guy is? I'm not going to go see him." And God says, not only have I brought him to myself, but I've showed him he will be my missionary to the Gentiles, and everything he will have to suffer in order to do that. Now, I don't know whether that means that Paul saw every single time he was going to be stoned and left for dead, every single time he was going to be beaten, but he knew that it was not going to be easy, but he was the one who had to go. The third great vision we know that he mentions here in the book of 1 Corinthians is he's given a vision of heaven. A vision of what things are like in heaven, of the actual environment, and looking around and somehow brought up there and sees the glory of God on his throne with the angels around him and all of the people there in heaven. And upon having these 3 visions, this is what happens. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me, and he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distress, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then he is strong." This is not a rhetorical question. What are some ways that God has blessed you? So somebody throw something at me. Some way that God has blessed you.
Family.
With family?
Grandchildren.
With grandchildren?
Health.
With health?
3-time survivor.
I'm sorry, 3-time cancer survivor? Talk about health and then some. Absolutely. Anybody else want to share something?
Ministry.
Being able to be involved in ministry? Give it your best shot, buddy. That's okay. Thanks for raising your hand. He was like, "Yeah, I've got one." Oh wait, I forgot. That's okay. So God blesses us through not only the things we've said, but so many different ways. Here, Paul is talking about being blessed with these visions of God, with an understanding of his place and his purpose, with some hint that he was going to be the most influential Christian of the century as we look back on it. And that God understood that oftentimes in our area of blessing, there is a temptation to pride, a temptation to exalting ourselves, a temptation that when somebody came up and confronted Paul, he would go, wait a minute, Peter. God sent me to the Gentiles, not you. I smell bacon on your breath, Peter. I know you're not the one. I'm the one that's been sent to the Gentiles. That when somebody comes up and says, well, I'm not sure whether or not people rise from the dead, Paul would go, look. I've seen heaven. I know what I'm talking about. But that God, instead of him letting him rely on his own power, on his own visions, on his own sense of his importance, that God brings into his life this weakness that we don't even know what it is. It says it was a thorn in his flesh from Satan. We know there was physical pain involved. I cannot tell you the number of trees that were killed in various debates about what exactly it is. You know what the answer is? God doesn't want us to know. So instead of speculating, we know that it was something physically painful that he could not get rid of, that was with him day in and day out, that somehow reminded him over and over again of the power of God. As we look at our life and we look at our blessings, there's a temptation to let our blessings become the basis of our pride. And what God reminds us of here is that we don't have those things because we're so special. We have those things because he gave them to us. Which means we didn't earn them, and they're not our fault, and they're not because we're wonderful. It helps us to stay grounded. It helps us not to be against that. It says here that his suffering, what it illuminates is his weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. We don't like to be weak. We don't want to be weak. We want to be seen strong. In our workplace, we want to be seen as strong and competent and knowing everything that's going on. As parents, we want to be seen as strong and authoritative, and I know what's happening, and quit asking me that question again. That as people who are, grandparents, I know you want to appear wise, you get to have candy and give that away, which is great, but there's that desire to look like you always know what you're talking about and you always know the answer. That our desire over and over again into different places of our life, when we get into playing backyard sports, that we want to play the sports where we're going to win, and where we can't, we say, oh, I've got too much to do. But what God tells us is this message within our culture that says win, 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 is actually exactly backwards of his message for us. He tells us that he is not made glorious in our successes. That he is not made glorious and shown to the world in us getting things done, in us becoming famous, in us getting pop songs produced, in us somehow finding a way to amass this great big stadium or win votes or any of those things. He says that my power is perfected in weakness. And as we look throughout the Bible, as we look at the history that we see, that's what we see over and over again. God comes to Abraham and brings him to himself and uses him to start the Jewish nation. But Abraham was a liar. And not just once. We see Moses, who was a murderer and a coward. And God uses him mightily to bring the people out of Egypt. We see David, who was an adulterer and a violent man. And the Lord uses him to unite the nation of Israel and make it what it can be. That over and over again throughout the Bible, we see God take people who are weak, who are messed up, who have problems, who have difficulties, and then work through them in a way that shows his power. Just this morning, the Sunday school lesson that I was teaching had Peter and John healing someone from their lameness and that person being able to walk. And as they're brought before those who want to put them on trial for the miracle that they did, it says they noticed that they were ordinary men, untrained, but they had been with Jesus. That those who were trying them knew that these are just ordinary guys who go fishing for a living. But because God's in them, this amazing thing happened. And what God is doing here with Paul in the book of 2 Corinthians, and what God wants to do with us, is he wants us to understand that his power is made perfect, not in our good reputation, not in our getting everything right, not in our having it all together, being dressed right on Sunday morning. It's not in our having all our ducks in a row and doing everything perfect at work and getting the high attendance bonus and everything else. That his power is perfected in our weakness. His power is perfected in those places where people look at us and they go, I really don't think they could do that. Something else has got to be going on here. Something else has got to be working here in this person to make this result happen. That somehow we're speaking, or we're living, or we're loving beyond what ought to be our normal capacity. And when people see that, they know it's got to be God. That it can't be us. You see, our very weakness, those very times where we're most embarrassed, where we're most upset, where we're most frustrated, where we feel inadequate and we feel like the situation is impossible and we feel like there's no way that this can be what God wanted in my life, are those very times when the people around us are forced to say, that's got to be God. That's got to be God working. Because I know I could never act that way under those circumstances. That's got to be God working, because I know my little sister, and she's just not that smart, but she's getting straight A's in nursing school. Took you a minute, didn't you? God's power is perfected in our weakness. And so what Paul is telling us to do, what God is telling us to do, is to resist our first temptation. Our first temptation, when we are spending time with someone else, when we are getting introduced to someone else, when we are getting to know someone, is to put our best foot forward. Is to say the things that are expected. Is to minimize our problems and maximize our successes. To put ourselves in the best light possible, so that they can see how nice we are, how kind we are, how friendly we are, how strong we are, how good looking we are. Well, I'm really out on that one. But anyway, all of these different things that are temptation is to present this version of ourselves that's better than reality, that's bigger than life. And God calls on us to go the exact other direction. To have honesty, authenticity, transparency, to show who we really are. To be willing, instead of putting on the mask and playing the game of who's the smartest, who's the most accomplished, who makes the most money, etc., to just be ourselves. And to choose to let God work through that. To choose to let people see our problems when there are problems. To choose to let people see our shortcomings where we have shortcomings instead of pretending that we're better than we are. To choose to let people see our failures and our problems and our sorrows. Now please understand, I'm not talking about becoming Moaning Myrtle from the Harry Potter movies, all right? I'm not talking about walking around going, my life is so bad. How are you today? I'm not fun. Now get this right. Sometimes that's true. If it's true every day, that's another form of dishonesty. But what I'm talking about is that when it's not social grease of, how you doing? Fine. How you doing? Fine. But they're really saying, how are you really? Being willing to tell the truth. That when somebody says, how's that project going? Being willing to tell the truth. That when we're in a martial arts class and we get hit and it hurt, being willing to say, yeah, really, I'm going to sit down for a while. And trusting that we don't have to be God's PR agent. Trusting that when somebody comes up to us, our response does not always have to be, oh, I'm blessed. When our mom's in the hospital and we're not sure if she's going to make it out. Trusting that God can work just as effectively, and well, He says more effectively, through us honestly showing where we're hurting. Better than He can work through us pretending everything is fine so they won't think badly of God. And there's a reason we've got to do that. Because a very crucial thing happens in us as human beings when we're finally willing to admit that we're weak and God still loves us. Because when we can be weak and God still loves us, we can let other people be weak too. We don't have to judge them and be angry with them because they don't live up to what we think they ought to be. I heard a great story this week from a guy by the name of John Gray. He was preaching in a friend's church. And he was talking about his cousin Rex. And he said, my cousin Rex, he had a lot of issues growing up. He had gender identity issues. He had orientation issues. He had major issues with drugs and with homelessness. But that John's mother would go and find Rex wherever he was. She'd go out on the street and drive around and find him. She'd get him to come into her house on Saturday night. And then that Sunday morning, she'd get a hold of Rex and she'd say, you're coming to church with me. You need Jesus. And she would get him and she'd march him in. And, whether it because Rex was still kind of half drunk and didn't know what was going on, or whether he just was glad that somebody wanted him around at all, he would come. And Rex came and people saw him coming down the aisle, smelling a little bit like weed, smelling like homelessness. And they might give him a look askance. That people recognized that he wasn't all the way there. And they might look at him wrong and be a little bit upset, but his aunt didn't let that bother her. She got a hold of him and brought him in morning after morning. And Rex sat there and he listened to the preaching and he listened to the singing. And not a thing happened. Not a thing changed. Not a thing was different. He didn't get off the streets. He didn't quit the lifestyle he was living in. He didn't do anything. He kept on. And it got to the point where, because this was the 90s, he became infected with AIDS. And he was in the hospital, wasn't able to come to church anymore. There, John and his mother were there with Rex in the hospital. And finally, just days before he passed, Rex thanked his aunt for not giving up on him. Thanked his cousin for not walking away from him, even though he knew that his life was the opposite of what his cousin would endorse. And there, in that hospital bed, he put his faith in Jesus. Now, maybe I'm wrong. But if that's what it takes for someone to decide that they want Christ, that they want heaven, then it's worth whatever amount of trouble that we might be put to love somebody who's weak like that and gets brought into our church service. I might be wrong, but I think that if somebody comes in smelling of the street or smelling of the weed or still half in the bag when they come in the door, but their aunt or their cousin or their brother or themselves are dragging them in because they know they need to do something about God, then it's worth whatever it costs us to love them when they walk in the door. And the only way we're going to do that is if we can look at them and say they're weak and Jesus loves them. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we can look in the mirror and we can say, I am weak, but Jesus loves me. That's why God takes us through this. That's why nobody gets saved and then goes off to battle and is all triumphant in their life and moves from blessing to blessing and everything's wonderful all the time. Because God knows that we've got to be wounded, that we've got to be weak before we can love people around us who are. And so my encouragement to you this week is to accept the places where you don't look like God wants you to look. I'm not saying don't keep working on them. I'm not saying don't keep trying to grow closer to God. We need to do that. But accept that that's part of who you are. And that God still loves you before you get that fixed. And then with that already there, let Him work through you to love others who are weak and welcome and care for them. At this point in the service, we're going to stop. We're going to take some time to receive the offering. The offering